السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. Good evening and welcome back. Hopefully the drive wasn't too chaotic. Okay, it's only bad if there are bad drivers. Absolutely agree. May Allah make us not from the bad drivers, inshallah. Hopefully the drive home isn't too bad either, inshallah. Many people ask me if we would be pausing at all during these weeks. I prefer to keep consistency so that we continue learning, even if not everyone's able to make it. They can catch up online, but I'm a very big believer in consistency. I think that's one of the main lessons we learn from prayer, is to be consistent. Whether you're sick or you're not, you stand or you can't stand, but you don't leave the prayer. The prayer is there all the time. And similarly, I think learning should be a steady process. Consistency is required for that. So tonight, inshallah, we're going to continue our conversation that we started last week on the topic of love. Hopefully we've been thinking a little bit about the topic since last week. Last week we spoke a little bit about how every part of the human has something that it desires. The eyes desire to look at pleasant and beautiful things. The ears desire to listen to beautiful things. The heart, we spoke about, desires divine and lofty matters. And the greatest desire of the heart is God, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea. We mentioned last week that classically there were three transcendental goods that people understood were objects of desire of the heart: truth, goodness, and beauty. That all human beings, so long as their heart was not corrupt, they would at some level seek truth, they would seek goodness, and they would seek beauty. And they would admire truth, they would admire people of goodness and people of beauty, both inward and outward. Last week we spoke a lot about why is it that we struggle with love? Why is it that as a society we seem to be more dominated by lust as opposed to love? And we explored the sources of both. Now, a question that remained to be discussed was, well, how does one develop love? What does it take for you to love the things that you should love? Because sometimes we do love, but we love the wrong things. And that's an interesting idea. The idea that the human heart could really love something, whereas that thing is actually not good for the individual. Just like the senses can seek pleasure in things that are not healthy. And one example is, how many of you have at some point tried to cut out sugar, or at least processed sugar at some point? Anyone ever tried it? Or maybe still does it maybe? And did you notice how when you did that, suddenly fruit started to taste so much better? One. And just things that previously you wouldn't really appreciate were like quite delicious. Right? It's like the palate was cleansed, and suddenly you were able to appreciate like genuine, good, nutritious foods because the palate wasn't being spoiled by, refined and processed sugars and foods that contain that sugar. And so it's almost like a cleanse is required to really develop an appreciation for what's actually healthy. Because what's unhealthy can be very pleasing but harmful. And this seems to be like almost a a joke we make. Anyone ever said, like, this is too good to be healthy? Anyone ever said that? It's too good to be healthy. Muslims sometimes say, and may Allah forgive us, this is too good to be halal. Like, is this haram? Is something in here? Right? Like, it's just questionable. Like, what's going on here? But like, it's too good to be healthy. It's subhanallah. Right? It's the idea that almost intuitively we know that the things that are actually really good for us may not always be the most pleasing. The thing is, we sometimes give in to those objects of pleasure and we consume them, and then we can't really appreciate true, healthy good. Another example of this would be how, scholars talk about music, right? And I'm not going to get into the discussion about, permissible or impermissible or, instruments and stuff like that. But scholars talk about how much Quran do you listen to versus how much music do you listen to. That's one way to look at it. If you listen to a lot more music than Quran, I think it's questionable at that point, regardless of what you think the ruling is. And the thing is, it's hard. It's really hard to appreciate the Quran if there's a constant, steady diet of music, which is so, enriched with different melodies and sounds and instruments. And for Quran, you just have a person's singular voice, reciting sometimes words in a language that you don't understand. And it's hard, because the heart's so used to this that it can't appreciate this over here, the Quran. And so one of the ways to develop love for truly good things is to recognize that maybe we are consuming a very unhealthy diet of things that aren't good. And when we start to cut those out, things that previously were just whatever, suddenly we take so much effect from them. That's something we learn in the month of Ramadan. People notice in the month of Ramadan often that their heart seems to be so much more receptive to lectures, to Quran. If you're reading a book, you're standing in prayer, it just seems like the heart's, is hit different, right? It's affected in a different way. Why is that? It's because throughout the day, we are starving the nafs. Like literally starving the nafs. But people often leave out a lot of haram too in the month of Ramadan. So they're starving the nafs of all the other non-food desires too. Right? I'm not going to talk to her. I'm not going to talk to him. I'm not going to be on my phone all day. People start trying to really do good things. In the process, they cut out a lot of harmful things, even if it's for 1 month. And they notice a correlation here. Wait, when I cut these things out, subhanallah, suddenly I'm just affected. And we notice a spiritual high. This is a case of correlation does equal causation. Absolutely. The fact that you cut these things out means you weaken the nafs, the lower self, the desires. Suddenly your ruh, your spirit's able to breathe. It's like, oh wow. And it's able to appreciate all the beauty and goodness in the Quran, in the lectures, in the acts of worship that we engage in. It's the idea of, have you ever cut out your phone when you go camping or something? And you just enjoy the conversation for the first time in months. You're like, yo, that was 3 hours? We just talked? We hadn't done that in a long time. Because we settled for this. We settled for this. It's so much more convenient. But subhanAllah, you engage in that convo. What human beings truly desire is connection. It's to be understood. How much satisfaction can you really get from text? Because text can be so easily misunderstood. But to sit in someone's presence, heart to heart, looking in their eyes, having a meaningful conversation. And sometimes, you see their face light up with laughter. You see their eyes well up with tears. Like that's a meaningful conversation that no amount of emojis can ever convey over text. And we sometimes forget that, right? It's a really deep, meaningful conversation reminds us of the power of coming together, putting aside phones, for example. So there's so many examples in our lives of when we cut out unhealthy things, we start to really appreciate the healthy things. We start to really appreciate the healthy things. And love is no different. On the spiritual path, as you're trying to grow, you ought to become a more loving person. Why? Because on the spiritual path, a big focus is on suppressing your desires. Suppressing your desires. We talked last week about the human being having animalistic tendencies, passions, desires, lust, greed, gluttony, appetite. That's part of what it means to be human. The goal is to restrict that, to limit that. And when you do that, which you have to do very intentionally, it enables the heart then to actually appreciate true beauty in the world. Appreciate deep, meaningful connection with people and the things around you. Sometimes people go, I took my nephew once for like camping. First day, dude was miserable. Because it was like a detox, right? Every single day prior to that, for the last like months, he would watch stuff on TV, be on his computer, a cell phone, whatever. First day camping, no electronics. That first day, man, he's like, yo, I'm so bored, right? I'm so bored. Like, yo, what are we doing? You know? By the third day, loved it. It's almost like he just had to get it out of the system. And then he actually enjoyed hiking. He actually enjoyed looking at birds. It's incredible what the human being gets used to and then neglects. And sometimes all it takes is a little bit of a cleanse to develop that appreciation. So, one way to develop love is to begin to restrict all the unhealthy consumption that we're involved in, as a result of which we're not really developing that taste for what's truly good. That's why I also believe we need to read good literature. There's something unique about reading a good book compared to watching some random show. Subhanallah, and as a culture, we're struggling with this idea of reading now. But to read a good book, what it does for you is as you sit and read, you really start thinking about deeper ideas. And that's what good books have always been able to do, is not merely surprise you or scare you or trigger some immediate emotion within you. A good book has you walking away from it in wonder, curiosity, reflection, contemplative. Like you're really thinking about deeper truths and realities of life. And the beautiful thing about good books is you can always come back and read them again. And they'll offer you something new based on how much you've grown. Whereas if you watch something or read something just for the immediate emotion, after you read it one time, you can't read it again. Because you know what's happening next, so it won't elicit the same reaction. So I already watched that. I already read that. But a good book, people will come back over and over and over again. Because it'll offer you an insight that you sit there and go, I never thought about it like that. How many of you have heard of the hero's journey? Hero's journey? One? Anybody else? Okay, I'm not going to explain the whole thing, but after you learn the hero's journey, you go back to like books and movies and you see it in a whole different light. In light of that, the whole plot. And then you start to apply that to your life. And so it's really something to learn, to develop a taste for something that's truly beautiful. And that is something that we do need to work on, is developing an eye and appreciation for true beauty, for what is truly beautiful. Now, to do this, one must appreciate the meaning and significance of things. And I'll give you an example. It takes perspective. Because perspective means to see through something. Perspective from the same word that comes from spectacle, which is, something that you see. Perspective is to move through what you see to the deeper meaning and significance of what you're looking at. I remember one of my relatives, we were talking about going to Niagara Falls and seeing the falls. And he goes to me, seriously, he goes, I could just go turn on the tap and see water. That's what he said. I could go and just turn on the tap. What do you say to that? It's hard. What more? Well, he's not wrong. It's water, but what's he missing? Yeah, exactly. There's something that it's hard to articulate to the person what exactly you're meant to be taking from looking at the falls. And I couldn't say anything. I was like, you're right, that's water, but I don't know how to explain it. And you just stand there and kind of soak it up, right? Like literally and figuratively sometimes, right? You get drenched. But you look at the falls. And you just that's a moment also where you're not meant to get hyper-intellectual. We call it, interestingly, non-Muslims call it a wonder of the world, right? A wonder. Notice that we don't call it like an amazing thing merely. We call it wonder, a wonder of the world. Meaning it should put you in wonder. Like, wow. Right? You don't have words to say anything. You're not sitting there going, calculating, that's like, 13,000 tons of water. But that's not what people are doing. You're just looking at it going, subhanallah. And you can definitely learn and study to develop an appreciation for beauty. But ultimately what it's really about is understanding the deeper meaning behind things. One person told me about how they traveled to Banff. And you could go there and just walk around and see nature. You could do that, right? And be like, oh, I saw trees, and I saw rock, and I saw roads and animals, and I came back. They wouldn't be lying. But this person told me that as they stood there, they said, I felt so insignificant. As I stood there in front of like Lake Louise or in front of the mountains, I just felt so insignificant. Here I am, this tiny speck amidst all of this awe-inspiring scenery. That is not just seeing what's in front of you, but seeing a deeper meaning to it. I gave you an example of somebody who just saw what's in front of them, did not see any meaning or significance to what they were looking at. So they came back and just described. That's usually what kids do though, right? That's usually what kids do. You say, you went there, what did you see? I saw rocks and trees, right? They didn't develop a perspective because maybe they can't appreciate the deeper meanings. And may Allah protect us from being children up into our 30s and 40s where we still don't have perspective. It's hard to explain certain things though. But I'll give you another example. Imagine you meet somebody who's a stranger to you. You never met them before. And you're like, oh, nice to meet you, right? Like, you're being polite. Nice to meet you. And then someone says, hey, this is your long-lost grandfather. What happens? What happens? In terms of your relationship with that person, the way you start looking at them and seeing them, what happens? It changes in what sense? It just takes on so much more significance, meaning. Because now you're not looking at just the individual. You're seeing a relationship between you and them. You're seeing how this person contributed and played a part in you being here today. And you say, subhanallah, that's crazy. We have a lot of catching up to do. And suddenly you're invested in that. How many of you have, maybe after you grew up and you met a relative that knew you the whole time, and maybe you heard about them, but you never got to meet them. But the first time you met them, they showed you so much love, right? I'm your aunt. I'm your uncle. And maybe for whatever reason, you didn't travel to the country or whatever, so you didn't see them. And the first time you saw them, you were like 15, 16, maybe 20. And they're just so elated to see you. You're like, I don't even know you. Technically, you're a stranger. But they love you so much. Because they're not looking just at a human. They're seeing that you are, example, their brother's son, right? Their brother's daughter. They're seeing you different. They value you. There's a reason why we love our kids and maybe not so much in the same way the neighbor's kids. Because we see them differently. The human ability to see meaning in things is incredible. Because if things have meaning to us, then not only do we love them, but we love things associated with them. This is the wonderful thing about the human being. You know, people, you ever had a family member travel and be away? Right? Recently, my wife and kids were gone to America for a few weeks, and man, I tell you, I walked around that house and I'm like, what am I doing here? Like the house lost meaning for that time. I was like, what am I doing here? Walking through these rooms and looking at my kids' toys, and it's like, without them, what's all this? Right? Because there's meaning to these things. I could see the same toy at Toys R Us, it means nothing to me. I'd be like, yeah, whatever. But I see it in my daughter's bedroom and I'm like, whoa. Right? It just means something different. We associate. And we have nostalgia. That's meaning. And so that's why it's really important for us to see beauty in the world. Because beauty is a form of meaning. So to develop, and we need meaning to process things and make sense of them. One of the challenges of life is that we're constantly surrounded by tragedy. Are we not constantly surrounded by tragedy? My office is across from the funeral room, you know that? Like almost every day I see a body being washed, like being rolled into the room to be washed. We pray janazas in this masjid almost every day. Almost every day. That's a tragedy. Right? So I see people crying here almost every day because they lost somebody. The world is full of tragedy. But subhanAllah, this masjid's really unique because, we'll have a janaza after dhuhr, and like after asr, we'll have a wedding. It's just, subhanAllah, like the contrast, right? To see tragedy and grief and then see like elation, the beginning of a journey after asr. It's like, Allahu Akbar. But that's the world. That is the world. And there's two sides of the same coin. That's the dunya we live in. How do you bear all the tragedy that you're constantly seeing around you? How do you do it? How does a soul take that much? By remaining a witness to beauty. Allah is beautiful and He loves that which is beautiful. And the human being, when they develop an eye for beauty, you will not see what some people will do is they try to find beauty alongside tragedy. So there's tragedy over here, and I'll look for something beautiful to kind of balance it out. Because if all you're seeing is tragedy, it's really hard. You burn out really quickly. You start to really question, what's the point? I think many of us experienced this at some point, if not maybe even till now, witnessing all the atrocities committed against our brothers and sisters in Gaza. When you just like keep consuming it, it's hard to go and get back to work. You're like, what's the point? When people are dying, when people are being massacred, all you see is just harm and tragedy. But subhanAllah, that's why it's so important to also share beauty. To give the human soul a reason to keep moving forward in the face of all that tragedy. And so what people of love do, subhanAllah, is they don't have to see beauty alongside tragedy. they will find beauty within tragedy. I think one of the best examples of this was recently the man who passed away, the man who captured all of our hearts, Khalid al-Nabhan. Subhanallah. There was something beautiful about his soul and his demeanor, despite the fact that the man was living through constant loss all around him. How does one do that? Is not just to witness the pain in front of you, but to see that there is a beauty to that pain. That this pain is not in vain. It is for the sake of something greater. And a lot of us, I think, found a sort of comfort once he passed away to say what? The one longing and desire that he had to be reunited with his granddaughter was finally fulfilled. Amidst tragedy that you see what? You see beauty there. You see a source of hope. And lovers can do that. Lovers can do that. That's why you lose someone, and subhanAllah, you find the individual who just lost one of the most beloved people to them, they turn around and they open up a charity, or they donate to a different country as a legacy or in honor of the person they lost. They're a source of goodness to the world in the face of that tragedy. But to do that, you have to develop perspective. And you have to develop not an eye for beauty, but a heart for beauty. Because to say that beauty is in the beholder of the eye is to say that beauty is just a sensory thing. Your eye does not perceive meaning. Your eye takes in sensory information. It is the heart that truly understands it. And that's why we say that, we don't say my eyes were moved. We say my heart was moved. This touched my heart. Like, that touched my eyes. It's like, are you okay? Right? Like, we don't say that. We recognize that the effect and impact of meaning and beauty is on the heart. So we have a saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. No, it's in the soul of the seeker, the one who looks for it. There's a story mentioned about the Prophet Jesus, alayhi salam, that one day he was walking with his pupils. And as he's walking, they come across the dead carcass of an animal. And his students, what they said was, oh, how disgusting is the smell. And he looked at the same animal and he said, how beautiful are its teeth. They both looked at the same thing. Two people will look at a rose. One will see the thorns and one will see the petals. It's a matter of perspective. How do we see the world around us? It's not the world that's going to determine that. It's the state of our hearts. Right? So the one who is, the great Maulana Rumi, he said, everybody has a qibla. That's the direction that your heart is facing. The qibla, we say the qibla for prayer is Mecca. You face Mecca when you pray. He said, but your heart also has a qibla in life. He says, the qibla, the direction of facing of the heart for the gluttonous person is the table spread. Like, they're always thinking about what's the next restaurant we're going to eat at. He says the qibla of the lustful person is to just look at beautiful faces and skin of human beings. But he says the qibla of a person who has a pure and clean heart is to be faced towards the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that's what it wants. It's to recognize that Imam al-Ghazali says something really beautiful here. He says, all of our love is actually rooted in self-love. People ask this question like, what does Islam say about self-love? Y'all ever heard the discussions about self-love? And a part of us maybe feels uncomfortable with it. How many of you, when you first heard that, was a little uncomfortable? Like, is that like covert narcissism? Like, what are we talking about here? Anyone? Imam al-Ghazali, he says, one of the main ways that you love is through your self-love. He says, because you love yourself, you then end up loving anyone who is good to you, or anything that is good to you or for you, you love it too. Not because you love the thing itself, but because you love what it can do for you, because you love yourself. Does that make sense? So because you love your own pleasure, you love your own satisfaction, you love your own comfort, all the things that can offer you that, you love them too. And so he says, who has done more for you than Allah? You love yourself. All the good that you have and you've ever experienced in your life came from Allah. And so how do you love anyone more than Allah? There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from Ibn Abbas, recorded by Al-Imam al-Tirmidhi, where he says, the Prophet ﷺ said, أَحِبُّ اللَّهَ لِمَا يَغْذُوكُم مِّن نِعَمِهِ. Love Allah for the blessings by which He nourishes you. Like, if you can't love Allah for whom He is, at least love Him for all the good that He does to you. You know, sometimes you love somebody just because of who they are. I think the example I gave earlier of, Khalid al-Nabhan. Technically, I don't think any of us have met him. I don't think he's ever directly done anything good, for any one of us in particular. And yet we love the man for whom he was. For the kind of qualities and characteristics he demonstrated and displayed. And so that's one way. That's why we learn the names of Allah. So that we can love Allah for who He is. That we worship Allah ultimately because He is worthy of worship. You know what, one scholar, they mentioned that if there were no paradise in hell, would you worship Allah? And they said you should. Why? Because He's still worthy of worship. He is worthy of worship regardless of whether or not there is heaven or hell. Sure, desire heaven because Allah, put it out as an incentive. But truly what makes Allah worthy of worship is not heaven. It's who Allah is. He is worthy of worship in and of Himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so sometimes we love someone for who they are. And sometimes we just love them for what they can do for us. Right, go ahead. Yeah, you're mentioning, just to repeat what you said so that everyone can hear it. It's mentioned that there are different people or different categories of people when it comes to why they worship. Some worship because they want paradise. And so these are people who are like traders with Allah. I'll give you worship, you give me Jannah, right? Tit for tat kind of thing. And then you have those who worship out of fear because they're trying to avoid the hellfire. And then he says, the third are those who worship out of love. They worship, they want paradise, but that's not what drives their worship. They worship Allah because they just love Allah. And they are more than happy to receive paradise, absolutely, but their worship is for Allah. This is, I think, personally, I find this to be one of the most beautiful things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's teachings to us. Is not everybody will reach a level where they will worship Allah purely out of love for Him. There will be some believers who will worship Allah because they want paradise. And if there were no paradise, maybe they would, second guess whether or not they would worship. And Allah created a door for everybody. All acts of worship from the three categories are accepted by Allah. And so He offers all different options, depending on how people are. I find that to be incredibly just of Allah, right? That He's opening up those doors, depending on how you are. Ideally, a person gets to a stage, like you mentioned, they have such a deep love for Allah, and that's what really drives their worship. But if they don't, there's still a way for them. All right, they're not hopeless. The Prophet ﷺ said, and love me, meaning the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, love me due to your love for Allah. Love the Prophet ﷺ for who he is too, yes. But ultimately we have him because Allah gave him to us. And he says, and love the people of my house, the Ahlul Bayt, due to your love for me. They are household and family members of the Prophet ﷺ. And so, to do that, we have to recognize the good that people do for us. We have to recognize what is an actual good. That's why, some of the pious of the past would say that if something went wrong in their life, they would always comfort themselves by saying, you know what? At least I didn't lose my iman. Yeah, I lost this, but hey, at least I didn't lose my iman. I've mentioned this before, but you ever got stuck in traffic? You're like, man, I got stuck in traffic. And then you pass by the car that you saw the car that got into the accident, and you were like, you know what? It's okay to be late, man. At least I'm not in the accident. Right? Because you value some things over others. And it's a real question for us guys. It's a tough one to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what would cause us the most pain if we lost it? That's how you know what your values are. We will all make the claim the highest value for me is my iman. But sometimes we might be willing to lose something else, or rather lose our iman to preserve something else. And that would tell us that something else actually is more beloved to us than iman, than faith in God. Yeah. Of this, what I just mentioned, Allah mentions in the Quran. He mentions a bunch of things that could actually be more beloved to us than Allah and His Prophet and Iman. In Surah At-Tawbah, Allah mentions, say, O Prophet, قُلْ إن كان آباؤكم وأبناؤكم وإخوانكم وأزواجكم وعشيرتكم وأموال اقترفتموها وتجارة تخشون كسادها ومساكن ترضونها أحب إليكم من الله ورسوله وجهاد في سبيله فتربصوا حتى يأتي الله بأمره. Say, O Prophet, if your parents and children and siblings and spouses and extended family and the wealth that you've acquired and the trade, the business that you fear will decline, and the homes that you cherish, 8 things he mentions. If all of these are more beloved to you than Allah and His Messenger and struggling in His way, then wait until Allah brings about His will. Allah does not guide the rebellious people. These are all things that can be actually obstacles between us and our love for Allah. You might say, but but I love Allah too. No, but you have to love Allah the most. The Prophet ﷺ said your iman is not complete until you love the Prophet more than everybody. And if you say, well, why is it so strict like that? Come on, isn't it enough that I just love Allah? Why does it have to be number one? Is it really that bad to love my kids? Do you get what I'm saying? I'll give you an example. When you get married, should you love your spouse more or your friends? And I hope we all answer spouse. Right? Right? We should. What if someone said, what do you mean I love my spouse more? Look, I love my spouse, but I love my friends. Is that bad? Is it that bad to love my friends? Hey, they were there in my life before you. What would you say? All of us at some intuitive level understand there's something wrong with my reasoning. We understand that it's not unreasonable for the spouse to say, no, I need to be more of a priority in your life than your friends. We understand that. Or if someone says, I love my car more than you. This car gets me places. It puts food on the table because I go to work in it. You'd be like, dude, really? More than your spouse? More than your kids? We see a problem with that. Because it says something about your values. As a spouse, if we feel that we're entitled to be the number one priority in the life of our spouse, understand that your Lord absolutely has the right to be number one priority in your life. And the perfect test of that every single day is prayer. Every single day. At Fajr time, is my sleep more important or standing up and pleasing Allah? See, one of the things about love, true love, is it demands sacrifice. Does it not? Ask any married person. Does it not? The hair starts to turn white after you get married, yo. Not in a bad way, but because it demands sacrifice. It really does. And for some people, that's one of the most challenging things for them when they get married, is stepping out of the self-centeredness. That's why in our society, which is hyper-individualistic, we actually talk about marriage involving a loss of freedom. You ever heard that? Subhanallah. We focus on losing freedom as opposed to what you gain. Because that's one of the highest values in our culture, freedom. The ability to go wherever you want, do whatever you want, whenever you want. And suddenly you're being told what? When you have to make a schedule for the day, you don't just make a schedule, you consult with your partner. What are we doing today? And if someone can't step out of that self-centeredness, that hyper-individualism, they will really struggle in marriage. And then they'll start to feel like the other person's controlling them. I just want to be out with my friends on a Saturday night. But she's like, no. Or I want to do this, and he says no, but we have to do this together. And it's like, no, but... And we really notice that. In other cultures, they would look at us like, what's wrong with you? Why are you so selfish that you want to do things your way all the time? Don't you recognize that when you get married, you're part of a partnership? Because love demands sacrifice. Necessarily, it demands sacrifice. And the test of sacrifice is, I would say, primarily through your actions. Because you could say, I love you, right? You could say you're my number one priority, but what do the actions show? See, love as a divine act is sacred. Allah Himself loves. The act of love is a divine act. It is sacred. The word sacrifice comes from the Latin roots, which means to render something sacred. That something is so important to you, I'm willing to go against what I would love to do for the sake of that person or for the sake of that thing. That's what sacrifice is. To give up your own preference for someone else. That thing is so important to me. So the question we can all ask ourselves now, what are you willing to sacrifice for, and what are you willing to sacrifice? That will tell you a lot about what's really important to you and what you actually love. And if you notice in Islam, there's a lot of sacrifice demanded. Allah even says in the Quran, you want to be rightly guided, you're going to have to sacrifice. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. So, interestingly, when people accept Islam or start trying to reconnect with Islam, it involves sacrifice. It's not like life necessarily becomes easier per se, but it becomes more meaningful. And there's something about love that makes the sacrifice enjoyable. Isn't it? Isn't it? When you love someone, you don't mind driving 2 hours. You don't mind driving 2 hours to go see them because you love them. When you love something, you will go to great lengths for it. Right? Don't you see Taylor Swift fans? No, I'm joking. But, you know, people do crazy things when they love something. People pay money when they love someone for their used clothing. And they auction, right? They bid on it. Who's going to pay more money for this jersey worn by this person? Right? That's what people do. They won't even buy it new. They'll buy it worn, which is interesting. What love does to a person. We talked about it last week. The classic example given in Arabic literature is of the example of Layla and Majnun, of love. Because it demonstrates to you what people do when they're in love. So there's a famous poem about Majnun. And Majnun has a lot of poems in which he says really wild things because he's in love. He says, أمر على الديار ديار ليلى أقبل ذا الجدار وذا الجدار وما حب الديار شغفن قلبي ولكن حب من سكن الديار. He says, I walk through the streets and I pass by the house of Layla. And so I begin to kiss the walls of her house. And he says, it's not the love of the walls that's in my heart, but rather the love of the one who lives within these walls. When you love something, you love all the things associated with them too, no? Is that not the case? When you love something, you love the things associated with them. That's why people hold on to hoodies. I'll just leave it at that. Right? Yeah, go ahead.